So I guess I can get started. So I'd like to give a slightly odd talk about sort of the research agenda that has been maybe the parallel work that I've been doing for maybe 5 or 6 years, sort of separate from the more mainstream research that I do. And originally I'd been thinking I would just talk about communication, but really it's sort of about computing under exogenous constraints. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about the why of what I'm working on, and a little bit about the what, but a lot about the why, and sort of, you know, what I think is interesting about this research area. And so I'm going to start in a strange place, which is maybe a slightly philosophical observation about, I think, computer science research especially, which is that all of our research entails some sort of prediction. And we do it as researchers, industry does it for sure, especially in R&D, and funders, you know, like National Science Foundation do it as well. And these predictions are somewhat implicit in the work we do, especially in systems research. Sometimes in systems we make things explicit, right? We look at the rate that you know, networks are going to be forwarding packets, or, you know, software forwarding is going to handle in 2 years. Scott was talking about this recently, that we think we can forward completely in software in a few years, or, you know, Moore's law is like a standard research prediction that we just take for granted. And they influence the problems that we select, how we select them, what we deem as practical, and what we deem as important in terms of research questions. And the predictions are often about the future, but sometimes they're about the expected uses of the systems we build. And, you know, in each of the sort of systems areas of research that I've dabbled in or worked in, there are inbuilt predictions that the community takes for granted. And I'm sure you can think in each of these areas of some, you know, predictions or expectations that we have about the future that we embed in the work. And, you know, when we deem a research paper realistic or non-realistic, it sometimes is based on, you know, our view of what is likely to happen in the future. But there's folks who are working on different problems with different inbuilt assumptions and predictions and use scenarios, and I've dabbled in all of these as well. And again, these are sometimes not made explicit, sometimes they are, but there's very little overlap between the conventional categories on the previous slide and these categories. The researchers are often different. There's very little communication between the two groups. And even the values about what is important to build in a system are different in these contexts than they were in the previous. And again, this is not made explicit, but if the research entails prediction, what are these folks on these latter topics predicting? What are they expecting about the future? What are they designing for? What do they think is important? And, you know, I'm sort of putting my sort of latter hat on, and so I'm thinking of myself as a researcher working on these topics. What are the things that I'm interested in and concerned about? And so these are some of the things that have sort of been motivating me and are in the back of my mind when I'm thinking about what are research problems that are important for the future: climate change, fossil fuel depletion, economic dislocation, and social unrest. And these are sort of external constraints, exogenous constraints to computing, but also to society. And there are plenty more, and there are many to be discovered, and we don't even understand the implications of most of them. But they're very big, and to me they're important to consider. And they're the motivation for things like green computing, ICTD, so information computing, communication technology for development, internet freedom research, and these are also things I work on. And they're also very related. And most of us in this room are not directly affected by these, at least most of the time, I don't think. But I'm reminded of this William Gibson quote that the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And that was a different time that quote is from, but, you know, these things are already here somewhere in the world, and they're affecting people, but the way that they affect people is very unevenly distributed. And so what I'd like to consider is, what are some future scenarios, the inbuilt assumptions that we think about? And we can't know what the future is. At the best, we can guess what the likelihood of different outcomes are, and those predictions are embedded in our research, and we might crudely break down the course of society, and then within that technological change, in 4 really rough categories. And this is, you know, very rough 4 categories, future outcomes that we might consider. We have the techno-utopian scenario. This is, Moore's law lets us achieve singularity. Artificial intelligence is, you know, unbelievable, solar powered, provides electricity too cheap to meter, et cetera, et cetera. Business as usual. These are the standard assumptions that we assume. Growth will continue at 2%. Technology will continue at the current pace of development. Slow decline, things slowly fall apart, and fast collapse. Pick your favorite Hollywood, everything falls apart movie, and you have a fast collapse scenario. Now, I think the usual estimate in society, but also for us as individuals, is probably something like this. The likelihood of a brilliant future or a fast collapse is pretty small, but I don't think people completely dismiss either of them. And business as usual, most of us think, yeah, things are going to kind of continue as they are. And it's not just what we think is going to happen, but this is embedded in our research as well. You can look at investments, for example, that research, you look at what National Science Foundation is investing in. They're investing in a little bit in breakthrough technologies, breakthrough research, but not that much. There's a lot of money going into business as usual, and then there's a little bit of money going into disaster strikes. There's huge, hazards. How do we communicate when all the infrastructure has been wiped out by a hurricane or tsunami or something else? There's a little bit of money going there too. And this is also the way sort of researchers allocate their time. And so what I'm wondering is, what if we consider a new estimate? And how might we reconsider the research priorities and what we think is important? And so in this, a slow decline scenario is much higher probability than it was in our usual estimate. Still, we can't know if these estimates are even reasonable, but for the moment, I'm going to consider the new estimate as sort of the baseline going forward. So in a world with these kinds of challenges, why even work on computing? And this quote from Bill McKibben sort of has stuck with me for a while. And by the way, this book, Earth, is worth reading as a good summary of sort of all of the different challenges that we face. And he's a good writer, as you probably know. So a few years ago, I started with writing a paper, Networking the Long Emergency. This was at the SIGCOMM Green Networking Workshop. It was really more of a position paper trying to look at these challenges somewhat holistically. And this led to a couple of papers which really are sort of analysis about the state of networking from an energy and resources standpoint. A little bit of design work looking into how do we redesign the internet based on, say, intermittent availability of energy. And then sort of a polemic paper, Networking for Undeveloping Regions, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So one of the simple things that we did, we wanted to understand, if energy is an important resource and something that we actually have to care about in terms of limitations, how much energy does the internet use? As networking researchers, it was kind of strange, especially doing green networking, that we didn't know the answer to that. And it's really impossible to know the figure there, so our estimates were intentionally crude, but the ballpark is that the internet uses somewhere between 150 and 300 gigawatts. But the more interesting part, the Emergy, which is embodied energy, and if you consider embodied power, which is the replacement of the devices that make up the entire networking infrastructure of the globe, is about half of that. And usually we don't think about that, but in green networking, there's a lot of research for 4, 5, 6 years. People look at how do we improve the performance of a router so that we can shave off X watts when it's doing forwarding, or things like that. There are projects on how do we make a smartphone use 1 watt less. Those are valuable for their own reasons, but in terms of saving energy for the internet, all you have to do is keep the devices longer, and you end up saving far more energy than most green networking research does. So it leads to slightly different conclusions than you normally would expect. Another study was to try and understand the material footprint of the internet, really of modern communications. And so in this paper, what we did is we did an analysis of every device that you might need for wide area communication and traced it back to the actual minerals and manufacturing processes that are used globally, and came with this really crazy graph. And the actual elements, the things that were dug up out of the ground, saw where they came from, and so really just try to understand how do we build networking infrastructure today. And it turns out, it's naturally very complicated. The materials that are required come from several dozen countries around the world, many of which are in conflict zones. I'm sure you know about coltan mining and all sorts of other rare minerals that are used in a lot of manufacturing. The question really we're asking was, okay, if this is the footprint of the material footprint of the internet today, how can we relocalize that? How can we do it without having this global footprint? How can we make it more renewable and sustainable? Because a lot of those are non-renewable resources. Another design exercise was to understand the various elements of modern communication and say, how would this work in an intermittent energy context? There are plenty of places in the world where you can't guarantee that, the power is going to be on, an hour from now. And while there's a lot of work going into smart grids to try and balance out solar and wind and other renewable sources, they are naturally intermittent. And so what happens if that intermittency is exposed to the networking infrastructure, right? We know that old school routing protocols are really bad at handling, flapping links and things like that. How do we deal with those sorts of things? And so we looked at sort of the, various aspects of the networking infrastructure and considered them for redesign. And there are known techniques to address a lot of these things. And incidentally, the known techniques come from sort of the sustainability and ICTD world that we can use to address the challenges here, but it's sort of, we have to change expectations of what the network can do for us. So those are sort of some previous projects and then some recent projects in this space, sort of rethinking what it means for computing to be sustainable. Some federated content systems work, which is a little strange, but I'll explain later. And then self-obviating systems. What can we do to design computing systems which make themselves unnecessary? And so by their use, people decide that they no longer need them instead of being, this is a very non-commercial idea, but I think it's probably a useful one from a sustainability standpoint. So the bottom line is, if we are looking at global limits of various types and a ubiquitous computing infrastructure, what happens? What are the things that we might want to deal with? And some of the things that have motivated me: decline of critical infrastructure, supply chain problems, resource limits, economic impacts, and social and cultural impacts. In this latter category, I include things like civil unrest and government oppression, which often comes from that. And so the way I like to look at it is instead to say, as engineers, we design everything we build based on some set of constraints. And sometimes the most interesting designs we come up with are when we tie our hands behind our back. And so what if we were to build computing systems for very different sort of constraints? And these are constraints that some people are working on, but it's pretty rare. If we had 10 times less power or 10 times more volatility of the power, more failures, slower device replacement, a lot of these challenges do exist in places in the world. And it's a question of, do we want to consider those in the normal designs that we do? Now, part of that, and this is one of the primary trade-offs that I've been exploring, is the difference between resilient systems and efficient systems. And usually we don't think of that as sort of a trade-off, but the easiest way to gain efficiency often is to sacrifice resilience, right? You provide less redundancy, and usually you make more money. And while this isn't an example in the computing realm, one of the classic cases of efficiency, which is not known to most people, is in the design of a nuclear power plant, you have a certain maximum power that you can operate the plant at, somewhat naturally. And what power plant operators often do is they go back to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission here in the US, and they say, hey, well, we designed our power plant to have a safety threshold of X%. So we know that we can safely run at this higher power. Can we please get an uprate? Can we please run at that higher power? And then the regulatory, they say, okay, go ahead. And so they increase their power to the maximum power, but the buffer doesn't change, right? So they actually just start running at that higher power, and they make more money, right? They're able to squeeze more power out of the power plant, but you've sacrificed resilience, and and this trade-off shows up everywhere. I don't know why that example always sticks in my mind, but So people are working on these problems. There's sort of a group of people working on limits, and I work with some colleagues at UCI and KTH. We started a workshop on these questions, limits. There's a lot of researchers doing ICTD work and sustainability and green computing. And what I've been wondering, and sort of this is what was in the abstract, what's in common between these? And a strange source for why I think these are very similar was the work by, there's a philosopher, ethicist, Tim Mulligan. He wrote this book, Ethics for a Broken World. He was examining what are the ethics of the actions we have today in terms of impacting the future lives of people, 100 years from now, in terms of sustainability. And the way he looked at it, he said, well, people who are, in ICTD, most of the research is done for people in developing countries who have less money, poorer prospects in general. And what's the difference between that and people in the future? Really, it's one group is distant in space and the other is distant in time. And the UN definition of sustainability, that's sort of the standard definition used globally, is to meet the needs of the present, but not compromise the ability of people in the future to meet their needs. And really, it's a question of, do we compromise the ability of people in the present, but in different places to meet their needs, or people in the future? They're really the same, and a lot of the situations are pretty similar. And so this was a sort of a polemic article I ended up writing about what I call networking for undeveloping regions. We can't know what the future holds, but what do these potentially undeveloping regions, the slow decline regions, look like, and how do they differ from what we might call developed regions or developing regions in terms of network infrastructure, the devices people are using, the availability of power, and the financial systems that they depend upon. And so in developed regions, the United States, network infrastructure is pervasive and advanced, although I have a caveat I will mention in a moment, which is not very far from here. Devices, people use the latest devices in general. Power is stable and plentiful. If you have an outage, it's a big deal. And finance is relatively, but generally stable. Developing regions, a lot of the target of ICTD work, you have spotty but advancing network infrastructure. Often you're using mobile infrastructure to replace, rapidly roll out networking, especially in places where there's not very good wireline or other infrastructure. The devices are lagging, but they're advancing, usually a generation behind. The power is intermittent, but people work around it. And the financial systems are stable, or varied, but they're, people aren't depending on them as much as they are in developed regions. The undeveloping regions, which we're seeing a few examples of around the globe periodically and, in the news right now, network infrastructure is varied and aging. It may be modern by some definition of modern, but there's not upkeep going into it. The devices are lagging and stagnant. Power is intermittent and varied, and sometimes it's an economic issue, and the financial systems are unstable. Now, how do we design for this latter category? It's hard to know, and but what I think is that designing for this undeveloping regions category gives us solutions that help us also in the developing regions category. And I think a lot of the times when we've looked at some of these problems, we find that ICTD research overlaps quite nicely. Now, the caveat that I was about to mention was one of the projects I'm working on to provide decent internet service in rural regions. And this is more in line with traditional ICTD research. This is a management system we built. The goal of our project is to make it easier to start small rural ISPs. And this is Mendocino County in our management system. These are all our users. So we have a operating ISP up in Mendocino with a little over 200 users. And there was no viable internet service here until we came in. There was satellite, which was really terrible and really expensive. This is not unique. There are communities even closer to the Bay Area, an hour's drive north from here, that have no internet service. Or as I was telling the Netsis group yesterday, there's one of the communities that we visited has pretty much 9,600 baud speeds that they actually still use dial-up because their copper is so bad that you can't even get better than that on your modem. And they're still using dial-up for internet service, and they live in a grove of redwood trees, so they can't really get satellite. So, there are places all over California that are much closer to what we might think of as an undeveloping region than we might imagine in the Bay Area. And so this small internet provider model is in line with sort of another McKibben quote that I think is useful guidance. And so this kind of strange set of problems and constraints and motivations for me has led to a few design ideas that are speculative and sort of percolating in my mind I wanted to share. Horizontal scalability, scale out, is a common principle in distributed systems work today, but it's seldom applied on the macro level. Scale out, the idea is instead of having one computational node that is super powerful, you have thousands of computational nodes that are moderately powerful, and you use those to scale your aggregate system. This is used everywhere. It's been very successful, but it's not used at the macro scale. We have huge organizations. We have Google, we have Facebook, we have Microsoft, we have Amazon. These are huge organizations, but in the services they provide, they are monolithic. They are large. We haven't had scale out at that macro level, and there used to be. And the sort of standard way of building systems a while ago was federated systems, right? If you think about the way that email is structured today, a lot of people, especially if you have campus accounts, people are using Gmail, they're using Google, right? But it wasn't that way before. Just like ICSI, every domain had its own email service. And there is a certain resilience that comes from that. There's also lots of problems that come from that, but there is some resilience that comes from it. There's different administrative control. And the failure of a few doesn't threaten the whole. And there's also a little bit of independence that we've lost moving away from that. And so I'm wondering if we can apply scale-out ideas back, and maybe it's returning to the way some network protocols and systems were designed in the past. But we've learned things since then. And so how do we apply our new ideas, but to these federated designs? How do we design things that fail well? And of course, we always want things to fail well, but to degrade gracefully and handle intermittent supplies of energy, intermittent supplies of resources. A lot of ICTD projects are designed with this in mind, but how do we do that beyond the sort of narrow ICTD context and apply it to all systems? And there's a long discussion I can go into about how there's a lot of work on biomimicry and applying sort of ecologically oriented computing, thinking how does nature resolve failure and sort of be self-healing and all these sorts of things. But often those are a little bit shallow in the way that they look at sort of mimicking nature. So, I'll stop there. There's a whole lot more on that. Open designs, I think, are probably more important than open source systems. And the sort of creation of a diversity of implementations, is nice, but one of the things that tends to not be as common today and used to be much more common was that protocols were designed openly. And, in this sort of scale-out system context that I was talking about earlier, I think that's, a pretty valuable design idea. And finally, what do we do in a sort of networked world where demand exceeds supply? And I would go into a whole lot of sort of topics that I think are of interest. And these, we have a workshop where we're actually sort of talking about a number of these questions. But I think this was a strange enough talk that I should just jump to sort of my final Bill McKibben quote as inspiration and take questions.
Can you talked about the Fortune 500,000 versus the Fortune 500. And there's sort of two ways of thinking about that. One is a sharing economy, peace and love, give what you need, give what you can provide, and take what you need. And the other is capitalism really working. Capitalism works when there's real competition. Capitalism doesn't work when the choices between Google, Microsoft, and Apple. And the same for power, and the same for telephone, and a whole bunch of other things. So what part does capitalism play in the kind of design you're talking about?
Oh God, that is a huge question. I mean, even the words that you used, what is capitalism, depends on who you ask. But I guess the answer I would have there is that having a lot of small players still allows for plenty of competition. I think that's what you're implying. And there are so many political aspects to this in terms of the structure of corporate power and all these other questions that are embedded in why the economy we have today is structured the way it is. The question is whether that can last. These are all, the companies that I mentioned and you mentioned are, they're global corporations. They're using the resource base of the globe. They are selling to the globe. Can that persist in a world of fewer resources, of more dislocation of various types, ecological limits that are, pretty fundamental? I don't know, and there's reason to believe that can't continue. So, in my thinking anyway, at least in this research, I'm assuming that those will go away due to natural constraints. Now, how it happens, I have no idea, and I don't think anyone does. But so maybe another way of thinking about sort of McKibben's quote is that we might end up with the Fortune 500,000 anyway. So what does that look like? How do we design for a world where you have lots of small players instead of a few big ones? Because one of the things that you can naturally end up with is a very balkanized, like if you imagine the internet with 500,000 ISPs, rather than, the tens of thousands of ASs we have today, that might be a very different internet and might be much more balkanized than it is today. And we probably wouldn't want that, so, there's some design work that needs to go into that. Now, whether we end up at that future, I don't know. But I think the main motivation of this work is to say we're not even considering that as a possible future in the work, the conventional research that goes on today. And we need to be. All right, well, I succeeded in confusing or suppressing everybody. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. They're just stunned.